Like so many English women of her day, Emma Dent was fascinated by the East and by the desert. So she was very envious of her sister Marianne and her friend Mary Booth as she followed their adventures on the Nile. And she was even more envious when in 1877 she heard they'd been joined in Cairo by her own nephew, Johnny Brocklehurst, a dashing young cavalry officer in the Blues and Royals, and that they'd all met up with the celebrated British soldier Colonel Gordon. Emma recorded in her diary at the time, "Colonel Gordon has taken immense fancy to Johnny and wishes to get leave of absence for him from the Duke of Cambridge."
October 1884. Dear Aunt Emma, I'm once again writing to you from the banks of the Nile, as I never succeeded in joining Gordon's staff as I'd hoped. I've left behind Aunt Marianne and Miss Booth. Gordon has taken quite a shine to them both and nicknamed the ensemble the Foreign Office. I'm bivouacked in the desert. No tents, clump of palm trees, a few huts. A veritable Bedouin, do I feel. We've been 5 days getting here, marching from daylight until about 4 p.m. over the most cruel desert. Black rocks, deep red sand, so dreary and tomb-like. This desert journeying is no joke. We've just had 2 days' march without water.
Johnny Brocklehurst was crossing the eastern fringes of the Sahara Desert on his way to Khartoum. He'd been hand-picked to serve on the Gordon Relief Expedition, to rescue a man who had since that first meeting in Cairo in 1877 become Brocklehurst's friend and mentor. Since the 1820s, Sudan had been occupied territory. For 60 years, an administration made up of Egyptians and other Ottoman officers had ruled this vast, unbordered territory, which they plundered for taxes and slaves. Until in 1881, the Sudanese rebelled under the banner of a 36-year-old Muslim sheikh, Muhammad Ahmad Abdullah, a community leader with a reputation for holiness and abstinence. His followers called him the Mahdi, a long-awaited and divinely guided deliverer who would restore the world to the true path of Islam. The Mahdi called his uprising a jihad, a holy war. His growing army of fighters fought under banners proclaiming their faith in Allah and his Prophet, and the Mahdi's divine mission.
I am a poor man of the desert, but I am the Mahdi, the expected one. I have been instructed by the Prophet, blessings and peace be upon him, to worship in the Khartoum Mosque. Khartoum Pasha. Do you believe that the Prophet, blessings be upon him, has instructed me to pray only in the mosque at Khartoum? No. I am to pray in the mosque at Cairo, and at Mecca, and at Baghdad, and in the mosque at Constantinople.
The Mahdi's armies, in their trademark jibbas or patched smocks, spread across the countryside like wildfire, besieging and overwhelming much larger and better armed Egyptian forces in garrison after garrison. By the spring of 1884, they were massed around the outskirts of the capital, Khartoum. The small force defending the city, through a siege of 319 days, had only rifles, a handful of cannons, and a few government steamers to keep the Mahdi's forces at bay. The man who led that final defence of Khartoum through those long, hot months of 1884 was a British officer. Charles Gordon, an officer in the Royal Engineers, was already a national hero, famous for his brave service in the Crimean War and then for his leadership of the ever-victorious army through hazardous adventures in suppressing the Taiping Rebellion in China. These exploits earned him the nickname Chinese Gordon. The British government, under Prime Minister Gladstone, had tried to turn its back on Africa, but it had been forced to cave in to the enormous power of press and public opinion, reluctantly agreeing to send Gordon to evacuate Egypt's remaining troops and civilians from the doomed colony of the Sudan. Gordon was picked because he had served before as Governor-General of Sudan, as a tireless campaigner against the slave trade. Now, with the Mahdi's siege tightening day by day, and with food and ammunition running short, he refused to leave.
Khartoum, November 9th, 1884. I declare positively and once and for all that I will not leave the Sudan until everyone who wants to escape is given the chance to do so, unless a government is established which relieves me of my charge. If any emissary comes here ordering me to leave, I will not obey it, but will stay here and fall with the town and run all risks.
And this is where Johnny Brocklehurst enters the story, looking after the camels for the heroic but doomed rescue force.
My orders are to follow the Camel Corps with 5% of spare beasts and be a sort of moving saddler's shop and livery stable combined. 5% of spare camels for the Corps alone means something like 300 camels, so it'll be a biggish job.
As the expeditionary force progressed painfully slowly up the Nile, its commander, Lord Wolseley, pictured here on his command vessel keeping off the flies, did his best to maintain contact with Gordon by smuggling messages in through the Mahdi's siege lines. Brocklehurst had already come up with his own scheme for the same purpose.
I was determined to keep in touch with Gordon somehow, and together with Baroness Burden-Coutts, dear Aunt Marianne and Miss Booth, and others among his close friends, we worked out a plan to smuggle letters and English newspapers and reports through to Khartoum. We managed to find a splendid fellow, an English merchant from Morocco called Curtis, to take on the job, and the Baroness generously put up £700 to pay him for this dangerous mission. Disguised as an Arab, he took the name of Abdul Qadir and went first to Cairo, where he had all the papers and letters shrunk photographically to the size of a postage stamp, so that they could be hidden about his person.
This was highly dangerous work. The Mahdi had spies everywhere, and the ring of steel around Khartoum was almost impossible to penetrate. But Curtis got through, time and again. 7 times he made the perilous journey with his precious mail, until he began to be recognized and came under suspicion, so that his last 2 mail runs ended up in the Mahdi's camp. But there was a problem in Khartoum.
When General Gordon received the tiny photograph letters, to his great dismay, he found that his magnifying glass was gone, and without it he couldn't read the letters and news reports. Necessity, however, is the mother of invention, and he remedied his loss by placing a water-filled carafe in the sun over the messages, and found that in this way he could decipher most of them.
Gordon had another problem. Wolseley was also smuggling in messages, but his were in a special code, and Gordon had already sent away his codebook to save it from falling into the Mahdi's hands. For some messages, though, this was probably just as well. In October, for example, when Khartoum had already been besieged for 7 months, Wolseley wrote, "We hear that the siege has been raised. Is this true? If so, what would be the use of sending British troops to Khartoum, which is desirable to avoid, if possible?" With such misunderstandings, it's hardly a surprise that Wolseley's force failed to reach Khartoum in time. After a marathon journey, 1,800 miles up the Nile, they were just 2 days too late. A small force on board 2 battered steamers fought through a heavy Sudanese bombardment, only to find that there was no flag flying from the palace mast. The Mahdi's forces had broken into the city before dawn on the 26th of January 1885, and Gordon had been killed on the steps of his residence. His head was cut off and taken to the Mahdi as proof, despite the fact that the Sudanese leader had specifically ordered that Gordon was to be kept alive. His death triggered an outpouring of grief in Britain.
Too late, too late. Loud through the desert sounds that piteous cry, and to the farthest bounds of England's empire echoes. There she stands, Britannia, stricken midst the Libyan sands, with bitter disappointment's venom dart, wrath in her soul and anguish at her heart. Too late. Where is our lost lion? See, his desert lair bristles with hostile spears. At Khartoum's gate, brave Gordon greets us not. Too late, too late.
Johnny Brocklehurst was no less appalled by the death of his friend and hero.
February the 8th, 1885, Korti. Everyone here is staggered with the news about Khartoum. Too late again, just as one was going to shake hands with him as it seemed. It's a curious thing that the natives here will not believe that Khartoum has fallen, and somehow I half hope there may yet have been some hideous mistake, and that Gordon will turn up and things come right yet. You may imagine things are not very bright here. If Gordon is dead, it is only our loss. As he always said, remember when I'm dead not to be sorry, as death is what I've longed for all my life. But I cannot realize that he is dead. I rode into the desert at daybreak this morning and felt very gloomy. But God is good.
As Brocklehurst tried to come to terms with Gordon's death, the expeditionary force was moving back down the Nile.
My camels are in a pitiful state. Food for them is very scarce. It would make you shudder to see a camel eat thorns. Hundreds of them have died in the desert after not having been fed or watered during the fighting. Still, they will work on, 20 miles a day, carrying 400 pounds we consider easy marching. They will also take any number of bullets without flinching.
Emma heard from Johnny that the box of swords which Gordon had sent to him had been found, empty, and that Gordon's last letter to him, together with the rest of those included in the last dispatch, and his diaries, had turned up in the steamer Bourdain at Shendy. Johnny sent Emma a copy of Gordon's letter, which said that he didn't intend coming to England again. If he ever got out again, he said, which was not very sure. But he hoped to go to Brussels and on to Congo, and hoped Johnny would go with him, and then on to Waterloo. He wanted, he said, nothing more to do with Gladstone's government.
With that letter, Gordon enclosed one of the photographed messages which were smuggled through by Curtis, to prove that Curtis had won through with his precious cargo. In April 1885, Wolseley and the relief force were ordered to return from the Sudan. As far as the British government was concerned, the Sudan had now been evacuated and deserted. But the Mahdi did not long outlive Gordon. He fell ill and died in Omdurman in June, just 5 months after the fall of Khartoum. After his death, his successor, the Khalifa, held on to power for 14 years, giving Sudan a Sudanese government for the first time. His base, this fortified compound in Omdurman. But in Britain, a campaign was stirring to avenge Gordon. A much more substantial invasion force made its way steadily south from Egypt over a period of several years. Its commander, General Kitchener, had learned from the mistakes of Wolseley's expedition. It was a relentless advance, relying always on strict discipline and superior firepower. Sudanese defences on the Nile at Omdurman were overwhelmed. It ended in September 1898 at the Battle of Omdurman, the casualties showing the difference between artillery and machine guns on one side and old rifles and spears on the other. Nearly 11,000 Sudanese were killed and as many as 16,000 wounded. Total casualties among Kitchener's regiments, 48 killed and 428 wounded.
Johnny Brocklehurst was not among the British officers who served with Kitchener at Omdurman, perhaps because Kitchener did not like married officers on his staff, or so it was said. Perhaps, too, Johnny understood that Gordon would not have approved of the element of revenge in that final battle, or in the mood of triumph that followed the British victory. In 1895, Brocklehurst had taken command of his regiment, the Blues, and in July 1899 he dined with Queen Victoria at Windsor Castle on his appointment as her equerry in ordinary. His aunt Emma was proud to read the report of his appointment in the journal The World. Some of the most handsomest and most gallant soldiers, it said, have been her equerries, and now Brocklehurst, the beau sabreur, a giant in inches, the staunch friend and disciple of General Gordon. It's more than 120 years now since these events took place on the banks of the Nile, but the clashes they embodied between Islam and Christianity, between independence and subjection, have only gained in urgency as they've unfolded into a new century. Yet through it all, the hot desert sands of the Sudan and the rolling green hills of Soudli have remained unchanged. And linked, too, by the heroic adventures of Johnny Brocklehurst and his friendship with General Gordon, recorded so well by his aunt Emma Dent and kept by generations of the family at Soudli, and by those smuggled letters shrunk to the size of a postage stamp, which you can still see here at Soudli Castle.